Welcome to the PPP webinar on Airfield Markings Assessment. Our objective is to keep this webinar as simplistic as the guide itself in under 1.5 hours. It is not our intent for this to be an all-inclusive training presentation, but again to cover the basics of these important topics. Today's presenters will be Greg Driscoll of PPP Transportation Safety Innovations and Mike Spidell of Sightline. Both have a unique and in-depth experience and expertise in pavement markings in the airfield environment. Let's begin with Greg Driscoll.
Well, hello. Today we're going to sort of fly through a four-part guide providing a few details beyond the graphics. We'll follow the guide on the basics of specification, inspection, evaluation, and management. Our goal is to equip you with the uncomplicated information you need to ensure safer airfields through proper marking management. To best accomplish this, Mike and I will be working together on each slide, sharing from our own unique view and experience. Mine mostly from 3 decades in the roadway marking environment, and Mike's from his extensive time in the airfield environment. And no, we won't always perfectly align. So if we don't agree, just go with what I say. Sorry, Mike, I had the floor. All right, so let us move forward. We're going to remain as brief as possible, but we also want to be comprehensive as we can in this short time that we have together. To make sure we meet your expectations, we ask that you use the chat box to ask questions as they arise. Then at the end of the section, we'll take a couple of minutes and we'll cover those questions. All right, let's get started with the basics of specifications. So here we'll summarize the primary FAA specifications relevant to the management of airfield markings, including marking material types, glass bead types, minimum retroreflectivity, and retroreflective deviation limits. Mike's going to start off here with us with the 6 most common marking materials. Mike?
Thanks, Greg, and good morning, all. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to join us for this webinar. I'm going to start out with the 6 most common material types used on airfields. The one that you're probably most familiar with is the waterborne paints. There are also solvent-based paints. Those are single component products, and then there are also plural component products such as epoxies, methyl methacrylate, and the preformed thermoplastic is also a single component introduced into the airfield environment back in 2009. I predominantly see waterbornes, particularly specifically the type 2, faster drying, but we're starting to see a lot more of the waterborne type 3s. There are some very special characteristics that go along with the waterborne type 3. One of them being it's essentially a flexibility characteristic, allows you to build a little higher, get a little more paint down, provide a more thicker, more durable coating. I also like it in situations where you have asphalt pavements or P401, for example. It's a really good utility on those surfaces. Also works well on concrete.
Great. Yeah, I've kind of chime in on the same thing. Waterborne, just a couple notes. Waterborne type 1 generally doesn't retain beads well due to the resin that's commonly used, so be aware of that. Type 3 and some type 2 paints are designed, as Mike said, for this high build, and that high build is it will give you longer wear, and also you can get better adhesion of larger beads, which we'll be talking about beads in a few moments. But that longer wear, I think it's the Texas Department of Transportation. I think their actual pavement marking guide says the durability of a paint is directly related to the thickness of the coating, and that's somewhat true. So you have thicker paint, it's going to last longer. Next is, well, that'd be a thicker line, not necessarily a thicker paint. Thermoplastic is the most common material that's used on our roadways, and it's very durable. We just did a 6,000-mile assessment, and I think about gosh, probably 70% was thermoplastic. So there's a lot used, but it has limited use on airfields, mainly due to its heat limitations and its weaker adhesion to concrete surfaces. And one last thing is just note that not all paints are the same. Even if you could have two type 3s or two type 2s or two type 1s next to each other, and they can be very different in their color ability to retain the color, their adhesion, their cohesion, which is bonding together without fracturing, their bead retention, application thickness limitations. Some paints you can build high, some paints you can't. Weather resistance also can vary. So just again, understand that not all paints are the same for sure. Okay, the next topic is beads. So the most common bead types. And you see here we have type 1 and type 3, which are the most common beads at this time being used in the airfield. So a couple of notes I have on this is type 1 beads are most often are made of a cullet or crushed glass, recycled glass, vehicle windshields, that type of thing, and they crush all that, and then they make these beads out of it. And that's compared to a type 3, which is from a cleaner, clearer virgin glass. So that's one of the advantages. Your type 3s are going to be much cleaner and clearer usually than your type 1s. Also, type 1s have lower retroreflectivity levels than that of type 3 and don't perform very well when they're wet. So you have superior wet visibility with a type 3 bead. And then also, I want to be careful because we're using a general term here saying type 3, but the actual spec is TTB1325D type 3 high index reflective glass beads. So these are high index beads, which is a little different. There are some type 3 drop-in beads out there that are not high index beads. And that's what's giving you that ability to see through or get that retroreflectivity under wet conditions and so forth. And then lastly is there are other beads, and I've seen some type 2s used sometimes, and even the type 4, which normally you can type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, they usually get larger. That's where your type comes in. So type 4 is one that is like the largest bead that we're using in markings, and usually, and it can be used only when you're using a type 3 high build paint because you need that thickness of that paint in order to embed that bead deep enough into the paint to make sure it stays. And these are great for wet conditions as well. So, Mike, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, really good information. On the airfields, we do not have a type 2 bead. We used to, but it's no longer approved for use on airfields. We have type 1, type 3, and type 4. But as the slide says, the most common bead types that I see used on the airfields are either 1s or 3s. And to be perfectly honest, I don't see any reason to go really outside of that unless you're using a thicker, more durable material, something like a preformed thermoplastic, where you have the depth, the thickness of material to hold a physically larger bead and properly embed that. With the typical applications that I see, type 1 and type 3, again, are the most commonly used. One special note about type 3 paint, or excuse me, type 3 beads, is you are not allowed, prohibited by the FAA, to use or apply type 3 glass in red and pink paints. And there's a lot of backstory to that. I'm not going to get into it now, but just understand these are the most commonly used, and these are the ones that I endorse with my clients. I think that the type 3, you'll see here in just a few minutes, it performs better as far as a reflectivity, from a reflectivity standpoint, nighttime visibility standpoint. It performs better initially and over time, but both certainly can be applied very well and perform very well.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and I'm glad you clarified that that type 2s are no longer used in the airfield. That's good to know. Another thing, just if you ever have the two beads and you think, well, just one's, and quite frankly, one's about 10 times the price as the other. So it is the high index beads are expensive, but if you ever put them in your hand, in the palm of your hand, boy, you can see the difference, let alone when you put them on a marking. There's a substantial difference in retroreflectivity and so forth. So we, again, like Mike, we support the idea of the use of a high index type 3 bead. All right. So now we're going to move on over to minimum retroreflectivity, and I'll hand that over to Mike and let him get us started.
So this is a chart. It's a very pretty chart compared to the one that has been recently added to the FAA's new construction advisory circular, and that is the AC 150 5370-10. And the newest iteration of that is H, or hotel. It was published December 21st, 2018, so very recently. And it included, in addition to some initial target values for type 1, type 3, and type 4 glass, brand new installations for each one of those materials. It also included, the last line was essentially a minimum standard or a threshold at which the FAA believed that an airport should consider remarking. So here are your levels right here for on white markings. Your retro levels should be 100 millicandelas or greater, 75 millicandelas on yellow, and 10 on red. And that is irrespective of material type. So I don't care really whether it's waterborne paint, preformed thermoplastic, type 1 beads, type 3 beads, it doesn't matter. They're saying these are the minimum standards: 100 on white, 75 on yellow, 10 on red. And this is it's a big deal. It's probably the biggest thing that's happened since.
We lost your audio, and we got it to. This is a big deal. It's that's where I'd pick up at as soon as we get your audio back.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, got you now. So just go ahead and start with, this is a big deal.
And this is a really big deal. It's probably the largest standard change I've seen in 15 years, my time in the aviation industry. It is essentially defining how airports must objectively measure the performance of their airfield markings, the ones that are existing, not necessarily during new construction, but how they're performing year round. And this is something that I think that Greg and I, we align on. We think this is a really good idea. This is a good thing for the industry and for safety in general.
Yes, absolutely. We've seen the Federal Highway Administration has been working for years on creating a minimum. Hopefully, we're going to see that by the end of 2019. Understand that these numbers, this 100 and so forth, these 175 and 10, they're not very high thresholds, to be honest with you. But we go into more detail of that in some other webinars we do as to what a millicandela is and what that means and how we measure it and that kind of stuff. But what's important to know is that even though they're not very high, they frankly they're actually exceeding the requirements, some of the requirements of the Federal Highway. So I really applaud FAA for moving forward with this. And like you, I greatly support the idea of having minimum levels for safety reasons. Also note that we experience much higher numbers than this 175 and 10 on our better airfields that are using these type 3 high index beads. In fact, we did one assessment on our end. We don't do assessments like Mike's team does, but we go out and just for promotional reasons, or we're trying to learn more about the industry or something. We did one, and I think the average on the entire airfield was like 690 millicandela, 640 millicandela, something like that. And that was white and yellow combined. Now, that was high index beads, So you will get a difference there, and you've heard us talk a lot about that already. Also, note that yellow is lower level, and it's usually that because yellow, or the darker the color, the more light it absorbs, and it struggles to return the numbers as high as the lighter colors, and that's why you see the requirements drop as you get to a darker color. And probably one of my things, and we'll talk more about it in a little bit, is just to be cautious that your yellow doesn't reflect white. You can have a yellow line that at night can appear to be white, and we'll cover that here in a few moments. So that's all I have. Let's move on to the next one. The next section is on retroreflective deviation. So basically, on retroreflective deviation, there's you take 6 readings within a 6 square foot area, and you go a minimum of 3 directions. You see here is just kind of a drawing of using a handheld retroreflectometer, and the maximum variance between your readings can be up to 30%. Now, this spec is unique to the airfield, primarily because the roadway system doesn't normally have such large markings that could vary in retroreflectivity substantially across a marking. Most of this, and we'll talk more about the application and so forth, most of this is caused because you have multiple guns applying the material and so forth, and overlapping and so forth. But this is very unique, and 30% is somewhat substantial, but sometimes you could be surprised at how easy it is to meet that 30% threshold. So, Mike, your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, this is something that the FAA specified in that same advisory circular I mentioned earlier. They're essentially looking for uniform appearance at night. That's really what this 30% max variance is all about. And I think it's a very smart thing for them to specify, because frankly, with any piece of equipment that is measuring reflectivity, you can get really good averages, but it doesn't tell you how uniform it is, or how pilots or even drivers of ground vehicles are perceiving it. So this addition, the 30% max variance, is, I think, something very important. What we see during our airfield marking assessments is that very often material distribution is inadequate, and it relates directly to how uniform that marking is. So the fact that we're not only looking for performance, but uniformity in performance is key.
All right, great. Okay, so now we're at the end of the specification basics. We've covered the common marking material type, the common bead types, the minimum retroreflectivity, and retroreflectivity deviation. So if you have any questions in this section, just please go ahead and get them in real quick, and we'll do the best we can to answer them. And let's see, we've got a few questions going now, and one is, this is from Rhonda, and it says, what type of beads do you use in red/pink markings? Let me hand that over to you, Mike.
Thanks for the question, Rhonda. That's essentially, since we can't use type 3s, the FAA allows us to use type 1 and type 4 beads, the other 2 approved bead types, with a caveat. The standard coverage rate for type 1 is 7 pounds per gallon of paint or whatever material, and then the standard coverage rate for waterborne paint for type 4 glass is 8 pounds per gallon. What you want to do is reduce those coverage rates by 2 pounds per gallon each. So for type 1 glass in red or pink, you're using 5 pounds per gallon. For type 4 glass in red or pink, you're using 6 pounds per gallon. It's a little confusing, but that is what the FAA specifies.
Great, and that's some good detailed information on that. What do you think? Here's one from Tim. It's related to the same thing. It says, could you clarify? Type 3 beads are not allowed in red airfield marking, which is what you basically said. What's the reason? I'll add on to that. Why can't you use type 3? What are they trying to prevent or create?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tim. Just to clarify, type 3 is not allowed in red or pink markings, and those red or pink markings on the airfield, particularly on the movement area are your red surface painted holding position signs at a runway intersection and your geographic position markings. Those are the pink circles, the pink spots. And both of those they're very important markings. So the pink markings, the GPMs, the geographic position markings, are used in SMIGs or low visibility situations. So again, we're not allowed to use the one of the brightest beads that we've got at the brightest bead, the premium product in our arsenal, our toolbox that the FAA specifies, which is a point of contention with me, frankly. I think that the reason, I'm going to try to make this short, I think the reason that Type 3 was disallowed in red or pink is an application issue. I believe that the perception from the industry and the standards makers was that the Type 3 bead was so bright that it was actually reducing contrast with the inscriptions inside. Think about a red surface painted holding position sign at a runway. It's like a big stop sign. The Type 3 beads were perceived to be so bright that you could not read the white inscription that was within that red box. So unilaterally, the FAA prohibited the use of Type 3, and they said you need to reduce the rates of Type 1 and Type 4. In my personal opinion, they have essentially created a marginally reflective marking on two very important two markings that where visibility is very important, again, in low vis situations, and markings that act as a stop sign for a runway intersection.
Great input. We had a similar situation in the roadway environment where the white reflective sheeting, our sheeting got brighter and brighter and brighter, more efficient with retroreflectivity and return of light. And so, but it got to a point where the sign was so bright. So I kind of see where they're coming from a little bit. Of course, this is quite different. But the similarities is that the signs got so bright that it was blowing out the black contrast. So, for instance, if it was a speed limit sign, we were struggling to read the speed limit sign because the white was so overwhelming because of the high reflectivity of that particular material. That's very interesting. I've got another question here from Jared, and Jared asks, does the FAA require or recommend a retroreflectivity test for airfield paint marking projects? I've had problems with deficiencies after contractors have completed projects and inspections are performed, but no spec testing was conducted. I'll pass that back to you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. That's a really good question. So the short answer is yes. The FAA does recommend and really require reflectivity testing. The standard says marking shall be measured for initial retroreflectivity levels at installation, and this new minimum reflectivity standard as well. But specific to your new construction projects where you have a contractor, you might have a consultant engineer that is the project manager, and your RPR or resident project representative. That is something that really falls under the consultant engineer's purview. Frankly, you do not want a contractor measuring their own work and saying, hey, everything's good, don't worry. You need somebody independent. That is something that should fall kind of in that quality assurance category, and it should be done independently. The RPR can do it. However, I can say almost in general, your consultant engineer does not own a reflectometer. A lot of the larger consultant engineers in the US, at least, bring a consultant like myself in with our equipment, and we not only do all of the control strip and calibration of the equipment at the onset of the project, but we do the QA at the end as well to make sure that the airport is getting what it's paying for. Good question.
Okay, great answers. that's interesting because, I have seen in the roadway environment, they have a lot of self-certification, which quite frankly is a little scary for me, but I like the idea of having that third party come in and verify. I think that's going to be best for your, to ensure quality markings. I have one more question. I can take one more. This one's from Robin. It says, for annual retroreflectivity checks, are you saying these should be done in 3 directions? This, of course, is addressing our last question of retroreflective deviation. So again, annual retroreflectivity checks, are you saying they should be done in 3 directions? Go ahead.
Thanks, Greg. And that's a very good question. And I think just to clarify, and the graphic actually shows a reflectometer measuring in what appears to be 3 directions there, not only kind of in a upward direction and downward direction, but from side to side. So I guess technically 4 different directions. The intent is to measure in the direction of travel and in the opposite direction of travel. So imagine a runway center line, for example. If you need to measure, obviously, in the path of the traffic, the general direction of traffic, but also in the other way too. You're really trying to make sure that the marking appears uniform in both directions of travel. So in my estimation, you should, especially with a small handheld reflectometer, to meet the ASTM standard testing, you need to measure in both of those directions of travel. For mobile assessments, those are the ones that we use the Road Vista LLG7A. We typically measure in the primary direction of travel. It's not as important to get data from both directions.
Okay, great. And of course, being the provider of that instrument, I'll add to that just a little bit that remember that meter is scanning left to right at about a 1 meter width, and it's actually checking for that lateral deviation as it sweeps across and scoring that marking for that as well. So it is, even though it's longitudinal, in its direction of travel, it's also taking this lateral assessment at the same time. So that's pretty cool about it. Okay, let us move on now. And now we're going to go to the inspection basics. And let's look at a list of the important points of proper inspection of airfield markings, including the inspection methods, the elements, and their specific characteristics that we're trying to inspect. So let's have Mike get us started with the 4 inspection elements in the airfield.
Thanks, Greg. One of the probably the biggest issues we see with on the airfields is probably reflectivity. That is basically how the beads are either embedded or distributed, how they're performing from a reflectivity standpoint. And some of the instruments that we've been talking about here over the last few slides have been really pointing those things out. And again, embedment and distribution are probably the 2 components that we see that are most often not as good as they could be. Color is another one. Certainly, you imagine a runway center line at a busy airport, for example, it just gets covered. But the rest of the markings can very often be marred as well by things like a lot of different contaminants. We'll talk about that soon. But certainly it's a good thing to look at during inspection. You also have durability characteristics like adhesion, for example, and then compliance with FAA or whatever governing standard it is. Things like dimension, alignment, placement of the marking, those are all very important to inspect as well.
Great. And I don't really have much to add here, except that, these are the top 4 of any type of pavement marking, whether it be a roadway to a runway. So if any of these 4 things fail, if one of them fails, the marking's not going to perform as it was designed. Okay, let's go to inspection methods. So I'll kick us off here. Basically, there's three primary inspection methods. One is visual, second is handheld, and third is mobile. And we'll start with visual. And the advantages of visual is, first of all, it's convenient. There's pretty much anyone with knowledge or somewhat of a trained eye can take and look at that marking. You get a chance. It's also a visual condition assessment, so it's beyond just looking at it. You can actually get down on your hands and knees. I've got several images where I'm sure Mike does, where we're kind of on our hands and knees, kind of taking a closer look at that line, trying to figure out what might be causing the problem. Is it adhering right, and so forth. So you can do a real good visual conditional assessment, or condition assessment, which you really can't do with the machines, because that this goes beyond the machines. And then, of course, it can be done continuously throughout. Every time you're out on that runway, every time you're out on that taxiway, every time you're on that apron, you're going to be able to do a visual inspection of some kind. And we'll talk more about that actually under management. Next is the handheld. The advantages of a handheld device is that you can combine it with the visual. So not only can you do your visual, but while you're there, you can use a handheld instrument. It's also, what's really important here is it's objective. It is a scientific assessment. It is not something of, oh, well, that line pops, or that line looks bright enough, or you actually have a number to go by, and that's the critical point for roadways and runways. And the other thing is, with a retroreflectometer, you can do a day or night inspection of that marking. So you don't normally, if you're doing a visual, you have to go out there at night, hit your headlights and see what it looks like, and then make a subjective judgment based on that. These instruments can be used in the daylight when you've got your runway shut down for a couple hours for your maintenance every week, that type of thing. So it doesn't have to be in a nighttime environment. And then we go to mobile, and the biggest advantage of mobile, well, gosh, one of the biggest is it's just fast. Its acquisition speed is tremendous. You can get out there and do an entire airfield and its taxiways. And a lot of times it's aprons and everything else. You can do those in a day or even a half a day sometimes. So they're very fast. The other thing is that they're incredibly comprehensive. So what I mean by that is that, okay, if I take a handheld out there, I'm measuring probably, and Mike can chime in on this, but 20 to 50 feet, I'm measuring a line. These machines are actually measuring at 400 scans. This particular one, the LLG7, is scanning with a laser 400 times per second. That means if I'm traveling 60 miles an hour down that runway and measuring an edge line, I'm measuring every 2 inches. That's a ton of readings. And so you're going to get a better sampling, a better understanding what that marking is. And then the last thing with what I feel is a great advantage of the mobile device is that you can use it in predictive management scheduling. So you can actually, if you do this enough times, you're going to be able to say, okay, this particular area on this radius is going to wear twice as fast as this other area, and therefore we're going to go ahead and schedule it to be painted twice a year rather than once a year, for example. So that's the inspection methods: visual, handheld, and mobile. And Mike, what's your take on it?
Just to reiterate how cool the equipment is, both Sightline, as part of its airfield marking assessment, uses these two instruments. When we're doing a full-scale airfield marking assessment for reflectivity, we use this StripeMaster 2 Touch Color and the LLG7A. The A is for airport. These two devices in combination are awesome. We've been doing assessments for a little over 10 years, maybe almost 12 years now, and we adopted these in the last 2 years, and they're incredible. They give us something that we didn't have before. Greg mentioned it's fast. It's really fast. It's like a 10,000 foot long runway. You can measure everything out there on the runway in usually about little less than 90 minutes. It just there's lots that I could go into detail, but they're very nice tools. What I will say is they can produce false positives. And it's not even that. They'll tell you exactly, they'll tell you accurately how that marking is performing in that instant. It does not necessarily tell you how long that marking is going to perform that way. So for new construction, for example, you're going out and doing quality assurance testing with reflectivity, and you're following the ASTM, the FAA specification. You've got all your ducks in a row, and you're getting great readings. It doesn't tell you if it's going to be that way in 6 months or a year. It just tells you what it is today. So the visual component of this, when Greg was saying, you getting down on your hands and knees and looking at those beads and how they're embedded, that's key. So when you're doing quality assurance or when I'm doing marking assessment, one of the keys is to get down, and I own both of these units. They cost a pretty penny. Great investment, but my $8 Bausch and Lomb magnifying glass is one of my most coveted tools. Little 5 times magnifying glass, and getting down there and looking at the beads, how well they're embedded, things like that, things like adhesion, durability, compliance, all of those happen in that visual inspection. Just one more quick note I'm going to make about, from an operations standpoint, airport operations, for your daily inspections, the StripeMaster 2 Touch is a great tool. For your periodic inspections, which might be airfield wide, maybe in preparation for a Part 139 safety inspection, that's when you use both. That's when a lot of airports give us a call and they say, hey, come out here and do an assessment for us. The ones that have done it multiple times now are starting to do what Greg mentioned, which is they're starting to spot trends. They're able to see, okay, well, this marking went from 400 millicandelas down to 250 millicandelas in about a year's time. So they're starting to be able to spot those trends. Maybe other markings wear faster, particularly ones like high-speed exits on a large airport, maybe runway centerline, taxiway centerline. Maybe those need to be maintained a little bit more frequently than, say, your edge marking on your runway or taxiway. That's the advantage. You can start to maintain on an as needed basis. That's how it will save you a lot of time and money.
Great, and I would completely agree that really, no matter what type of inspection you do, at some point there needs to be that visual inspection, because a lot of times what these machines do is they'll identify that something's wrong. And when you get that visual inspection, you'll be able to see what that something really is, what's more of what is the cause, not just the effect. All right, great. So let's move on to paint inspection. And Mike, I'll let you read through this and get us started.
Right. So as far as the paint inspection, we're really talking about looking at the stripe itself, not necessarily getting real granular into the bead embedment, distribution, things like that. We'll talk about that next. But when you're looking at the actual stripes, you're taking a look at compliance with either the FAA or perhaps Air Force, UFGS, something like that. We're looking at things like dimension, alignment, configuration, and all of those dimension and alignment criteria are not located in the 5340-1. That is now in May that turned into the 1M or Mike. Those compliance criteria are located in the 5370, and it talks about dimension and alignment. They're very tight. It's about a 1/2 inch tolerance for a lot of your markings, most of your markings out there. The other thing we take a look at is adhesion. We see, and I'm going to just go out there on a limb and say that everybody listening to this webinar has had some degree of chipping or peeling, because I see it constantly. The other thing that we see a lot is the color and really the quality of it, whether it's faded. And faded, I think, is an overused term in our industry. Faded, by definition, really means that the UV and the sun has started to deteriorate the pigments and the color of the marking itself. So many times, not only in airports, but inspectors and everyone says, oh, the markings are faded, it's time to repaint. Not necessarily true, but the sun does have an impact, particularly on reds and pinks. but yellows too. They tend to lighten in color or cream by that UV. And then also poor reflected color. It's something that we really don't think about. The FAA doesn't really have any tolerance for it, but it is very important. Greg mentioned it earlier. Sometimes a yellow line during the day is absolutely looks white at night, which can cause confusion, and we're trying to reduce confusion. The other things that we're looking at with paint inspection are contrast, like our black contrast. The wear, how thick the marking is, how uniform the coating is, and then the contaminants. Very often we talked about rubber and just from traffic or from landing, but also other contaminants, things like mold, fungus, algae, rust. All of those things can impact the quality of the painted line itself.
Great. I think this is a great checklist and pretty much covers all the major things that can go wrong with the markings. As you mentioned about color, color is kind of my pet peeve because I see it a lot on roadways where, as we were talking about, the yellow is reflecting as a white line, and you have, of course, in your system you have yellow. In the Airfield system, you have yellow means that you're on one type or one part of the airfield, and white means you're on another part. And to get those confused, especially on smaller civil aviation issues, or where people are flying in that aren't familiar with your airport, they're definitely, it could be a dangerous situation. So definitely watch that retroreflective color. And I know your instrument, Mike, actually the mobile instrument and the handheld both measure that nighttime color. So I think that's really a good addition to anyone's assessment. Next is adhesion. Can be a big issue, especially if you're using the wrong paint. Only quality Waterbornes have the proper resin that are designed to adhere to the concrete. And I get a lot of people to say, well, can I just paint over it? And I'm like, well, will it stick? And well, it'll stick to whatever it's sticking to. So if what it's sticking to is peeling up, then it's going to peel up as well. So you have to be really careful about how you fix, and we're going to talk about some of those solutions later, but how you are going to approach a situation with peeling and bad adhesion. All right, let's now move to, Mike mentioned a little bit about beads a moment ago and said we were coming to it, and this is where we are. So bead inspection. So you're looking really at three things. Is it distributed properly? Is it distributed from edge to edge of that marking properly and evenly? Embedment. Is the bead too deep or too shallow? If it's too deep, it will minimize reflectivity. And if it's too shallow, it will minimize reflectivity. It might show a yellow being white, and those beads are going to roll out eventually, and especially if you're using the expensive Type 3 beads, that's going to be a bummer because you're going to lose some money there. So, and retroreflectivity and the safety. So bead embedment is super important. I think Mike's going to talk a little bit more on that, of the importance of that. And then, of course, the quantity, is there too many beads? A lot of people think, well, if one handful is good, two handfuls must be better, and that's absolutely not true. But you also have the situation with too few. And I have a couple comments here, a couple notes. When it comes to retroreflectivity, it's all about the beads. Well, almost. It's nearly all about the beads. I often see these issues. Most are logical, but I think that one of the easiest to misunderstand is that just because 1 pound does good, 2 pounds doesn't do better. That's probably, again, the biggest issue I see a lot of times. We were out looking at some marking materials recently, and the marking material wasn't, he was going way too fast. He had a line driver, and he was moving along pretty quick. And I said, well, you need to slow down because you need to get more paint on the ground, or you're going to have to go with a bigger tip, so on and so forth. And so when he slowed down, but he didn't change the bead drop. And so when he did that, he was dropping way too many beads on the line. So it actually hurt the retroreflectivity of that line by doing that. And the other thing I see, of course, is a lot of uneven distribution of those beads. And a lot of times that's because the uneven distribution of the paint or the marking material. It'll be thin on the edges, thick in the middle, and therefore when you drop the beads on, they go across the whole line, but they only embed properly in the center of that line because that's the only place that's got enough paint to do that. So I see that a lot of uneven distribution problems. Mike, I'll pass it over to you on that one.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, you hit that last point there. We see a lot of uneven distribution too. I'm going to say, based on some of the average qualities that we look at, across, I don't know, about 7 or 8 years of assessments and looking at tens of thousands of different marking samples, bead embedment and distribution are essentially industry enemy number 1A and 1B. These two qualities are rated the worst among about 10 assessment criteria. When we're talking about visual inspection, with our assessments, we rank this the lowest most often. So embedment, I'll start there. Greg mentioned that yellows can appear white at night with poor embedment or when the beads sit too high up in the paint. That is exactly why, in my opinion, the FAA no longer allows us to use type 3 glass in red and pink paints. It is an application issue. It is not necessarily a material issue. I know this from experience. I've seen really good applications that look beautiful and perfectly red at night and perfectly pink and do not wash out the inscription. I have pictures of it when we do our symposiums. I get up on my soapbox and go on and on about it, but I'll spare you today. Just know that very often, if your markings aren't appearing yellow at night or red at night, it's very often due to the embedment. And that, by the way, that's not just type 3. Type 1 can also look white at night. So it's not a material issue. I believe it's an application issue. But it is one of the things that we see not done properly enough. Airports very often don't have enough time to paint. They do as much as they can in the limited window of time that they have, and that is absolutely backwards. You should try to do what you can well in the limited time you have. I know it's very difficult to get, even on a graveyard shift. If you've got an 8-hour closure, you might only get 4 hours of that to do some serious work, and maybe less. Distribution is another thing. When Greg was talking about heavier paint in the middle and light on the outside and how that affects embedment and distribution of the marking, it's absolutely true. When we talk about runway markings, we're talking about a lot of markings that are a minimum of 3 feet wide, or perhaps 6 feet or 30 feet in width. So in order to paint those wider markings, you have to basically what we call gang material guns together. So you might have and hopefully a minimum of 3. I'd prefer to see 4, and really my ideal is 6. I'd like to see 6 paint guns, 6 bead guns, all ganged side by side, all painting in concert. That is a very difficult thing to do well. Very often we see that the material will start to overlap. The distribution will make the marking appear uneven, non-uniform. Again, probably two of the industry enemies, number 1A and 1B. Tough to do well.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you covered that because, again, we see this in the roadway environment as well. Again, we're talking about that 6,000 mile assessment we just did. And when there was a problem, it was either there weren't any beads there were too many beads, or they were too shallow or too deep, or there was no marking there. That's a potential as well. But in most cases, again, even in the roadway environment, we find that it's beads. All right, so now we come to the end of the section of inspection basics. We covered the inspection elements of retroreflectivity, color, adhesion, dimensions, inspection methods, visual, handheld, and mobile, paint inspection, and bead inspection. And so we'll open it up for some questions. I have several already in, so let me get this out. Let's see. Well, I like, as a supplier, I like this first question. It says, Mike, I'm going to leave this to you to answer. It says, what handheld portable retroreflectometer do you recommend? Oh, and that's from Brian.
Thanks for the question, Brian. That is a loaded question for the two of us. What I use during my assessments is the Road Vistas Stripe Master 2 Touch with color. I like that as far as a handheld unit. Again, that's really good for daily inspections. For periodic, I'm into the mobile plus the handheld. Almost like paint machine, like a paint truck, and having a paint truck for the long line markings, the wider markings. That's what the mobile reflectometer is for, in my opinion, for periodic. And the Stripe Master 2 Touch, the handheld unit, is used for smaller markings, almost like you would use a small Graco for your smaller markings. That's when you use the handheld, and it's great for daily inspection.
Okay, great, thank you. And the next question, actually, this one's from Brian as well. It's for daytime color. Do you use a spectrophotometer? For daytime color, do you use a spectrophotometer?
Let's see. The real answer is no. The right answer is it's a good practice. There are some standards that are set by CIE and some other organizations. Nothing for maintenance. There are certainly color coordinates that you can collect with a spectrometer, and you can compare and make sure that the color of marking, whether it's white or yellow, they fall into those pass-fail boxes on an axis. But what I suggest for daily inspection and is a set of color cards. I like more of a visual inspection. The spectrometer doesn't necessarily tell you whether it passes or fails anything, because the FAA doesn't have a maintenance standard for that. It does have a new construction spec, so for color, so that might be something worthwhile doing when it's brand new paint.
Okay, great. Yeah, in FHWA we do have color cards that we can purchase, and you can lay it next to the marking and do a visual comparison of the colors. And that, I think that's what you were talking about on the color cards. Let's go to let's see, Michelle, and let's see, is using flash from your cell phone a good way to inspect airfield painting? I'm going to let you address that first, and then I'll come in and cover anything that I feel needs to be added. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, good question. I think that's flash photography, whether it's from your phone or from a well, I guess cameras are almost ancient these days, but both are good. I definitely recommend going out at night. As a matter of fact, the FAA's new construction advisory circular, the 5370-10, essentially came out and said, once you calibrate your equipment and do your control strip, you have to go out and evaluate it at night and make sure all the stakeholders agree that this control strip is what we want for the entire project prior to the onset of permanent striping. So they agree also that going out at night and evaluating is a really good idea with a flashlight, camera flash, the flash from your smartphone. All of those things really do show you any issues, particularly with the uniformity of paint and glass beads.
Agreed with how much it really accentuates and brings a visual representation of that bead disbursement and that retroreflectivity level across the marking. One thing I would caution against: be careful, because the intensity of a flash is incredibly strong, and so you just have to, you want to make sure that you're not. Sometimes you can flood those beads with the light from the camera, and so you will have a yellow line that looks white. But it may not be really that as bad as it looks. One of the things that we do in the roadway environment a lot of times is I'll take a a flashlight, and you mentioned a flashlight, rather than use the flash on the camera, I'll basically hold the camera up, and instead of using the flash from it, I will suppress the flash, and then I'll put a light, a flashlight, around its lens and aim toward the marking. Now, something to note, and what that does is that it kind of really creates a more natural environment of lights hitting it rather than the intensity of that flash. But one thing that's really important, remember, this is retro reflectivity. That means it's returning back to its source, to the source of the light. So you can't hold that flashlight down at your chest and hold the camera at your face. You need to have if you do this, you'll need to make sure that your light is in approximate same position as the lens that's going to be receiving that light back. So very important, and I do find that flashlights tend to give me a more real view of what that marking looks like. So let's see, we have, I believe, nope, that's all the questions for this section. So let's move on. So far, we've talked about the specifications. We've talked about the inspection basics and the specification basics. Now we're going to go to evaluation basics. Okay, so now we know the specs. We've inspected the markings. Now let's talk a little bit about how to evaluate what we've learned here. So I'm going to, oops, get rid of myself there. Evaluation basics. So there's really three primary evaluation basics. One is you're going to be looking at retro failure, you're going to look at retro variance, and then we're going to look at methods of correction. So we will get started with Mike. Why don't you talk about evaluating for retroreflectivity failure causes?
Sure, thanks, Greg. And we've touched on a couple things. We kind of started scratching the surface on a couple of these causes of failure. What I see typically is, again, glass bead embedment and glass bead distribution resulting in the failure, for at least for visibility concerns. The other thing that is that can directly cause either one of those things is the uniform thickness of the material that you're applying. 99% of the time, I'm looking at waterborne paint. So if you are spraying maybe a 6-inch line or 12-inch line, one gun, and it's not perfectly even, that will absolutely affect some of your not only your retro levels, but your uniformity as well, or the lateral deviation, we sometimes call it. As far as the marking, coating, and the contaminants on the marking, those can go kind of together. Certainly, the type and color can be affected. The color can be affected by just wear, natural wear from UV. But again, the distribution of how uniformly you apply it, how thick it is, those things can absolutely have an impact, both positively and negatively, on retro values. And then contaminants on the marking. We just went out and did this was a couple days ago, actually. We did a test for Kentucky DOT at one of their airports that had algae growing from edge to edge of its runway, and it was essentially obscuring all of its white markings. We went out there, we did a mobile assessment of all of those markings before, and then we had a contractor come in, do some water blasting with a light cleaning solution. We measured them after we increased the retro by 50%. So,
Wow.
Let's say you were at 100 millicandelas, we were then closer to 150 millicandelas after just cleaning, not repainting, just cleaning. So the contaminants on a marking can absolutely affect retro values.
Great. Again, I see this as almost a checklist for you. Okay, I've got my retro failed. What's the reason? Okay, so it's going to be one of these three things most likely. It's either going to be the beads, it's going to be the coating, the paint itself, or it's going to be contaminants, as you were talking about. I want to focus on paint distribution, kind of as Mike did. It's extremely important that your lateral thickness is consistent as consistent as possible, especially with thinner coatings like type 2 waterborne paints. I often see folks use architectural spray, airless spray tips. That's generally a black tip, depending on which machine you're using and what brand tips. And these tips are designed to feather the edges. And what happens is, so they're architectural, so they're really kind of designed to spray. Let's just say a vertical wall or something. So you spray across and it overlaps and the edges overlap back and forth and back and forth, so you don't have these runs. The problem is if you use these for pavement markings, you're going to have a thick center and lighter edges. And we talked about this earlier. I mentioned it in the bead part. Was what's happening is that the edges, the outer edge of those lines, are oftentimes the paint's not thick enough in order to retain those beads properly, or to get the embedment for proper retroreflectivity. So that's something that you really have to watch for. All right, let's now move to retrovariance causes. And basically, there's really two reasons that you're going to have this retrovariance. Either it's poor bead distribution or overlapping, or it's poor paint distribution or overlapping. We see this a lot on the larger airfield markings. Mike and I have a little differing opinions on how to deal with it. Excuse me, but I will say that Mike has a lot more experience on these wider markings than I do. Usually in a roadway situation, you can we can make a single pass with one gun, up to about 24 inches. So so we rarely have to go over and gang these guns for a roadway marking. But the problem that you see normally is that the beads are not being evenly distributed, or the paint's not evenly distributed, which can cause variance in bead embedment. And you could have a 3-foot line that looks like two 12-inch lines. So I think that can be confusing to to the airfield users. So Mike, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is you've hit it pretty well. Very often it's the paint distribution and or the bead distribution. The overlaps are a real thing when you're especially like you said, when you're dealing with wider markings. Again, my ideal is, if it were my airport and I had to spec a truck to paint my runway markings, I want a truck with 6 paint guns and 6 bead dispensers, basically one on one for each 6-inch line. And so you are required to slightly overlap those paint guns. So essentially on a 6-gun setup, you have 5 individual overlaps in between each one of the guns. I think that's optimal, but it does create some issues. If you don't have an overlap, you have a gap, and that is so the overlap is really the lesser of two evils. However, when you have that overlap, particularly when you're using, let's say, you've got an airless system and you're using switch tips, you've got, let's say, some Graco tips. Those, what you want to use, what I advise you use is those yellow or gold LL or line laser pavement marking tips. And those are what have been designed to paint markings as uniformly as possible for pavement marking. It is not an architectural tip. Like Greg mentioned, those black tips are not good for airfield markings. Unless, Greg, I know you've got an opinion on this. You want to share that one?
Yeah, so one of the fixes that we've toyed with is where we'll have the inner tips of a gang of guns would be these architectural tips because they're designed to overlap. And then the edge ones, the edge guns, actually have the the line, the pavement marking tips, which you identified as a yellow tip, which is correct in the Graco, and I think it might be red on Titan. And those, and what you do is what that does is that creates a more even overlapping. The problem with the yellow tips is that they are the same thickness all the way across. And so therefore, if you overlap them, then you will have a double thickness every time those lines come together. With the black tips in the center, remember in the center, not on the edges, but with the black tips or the architectural tips in the center, when they overlap, hopefully, the concept is, if they're set up just right, that you'll have the same more even thickness across the system. And really, kind of going back to, you have the paint distribution, but then of course you have the bead distribution, which can be, depending on what kind of system they're using. But most of the time, what we found is that it ultimately comes down to the paint thickness, because again, you have beads that, let's say they're in a double thickness, so they're embedded deeper. So that reduces their reflectivity, and then you have them that's in the normal area where it's single thickness, and so they're brighter, so you get that duller, brighter across the line. But yeah, but I think Mike, you've had some success with using. If I had a choice of my primary fix would be the architectural tips in the middle and the line striping tips on the edge. But if I didn't do that, I would eliminate the architectural tips altogether and just do the line marking material or stripes. Well, try that, tips across the entire system. So that's my thought on it. Mike, if you want to follow up on that.
Yeah, and I think I have seen that strategy work. I was working with a contractor doing quality control for a consultant engineer on a new project. This guy had a 6-gun setup, painting with black tips all the way across, and he was painting 6 feet wide in one pass, which is pretty much the widest I've ever seen. When he told me what he was going to do, I tried not to laugh and said, okay, well, this is going to be a really short calibration, and we're going to switch into some pavement marking tips, and I'm going to, ruin this guy's day. But I'm a kind of results-oriented guy, and I don't really pay attention to means and methods. He produced a pretty awesome 6-inch or 6-foot line in a single pass with his truck. It was pretty amazing. So it definitely can be done. The last thing I'll say about this, irrespective of how wide you're painting or how many guns, I really don't care. It really all comes back down to quality control. Somebody has to be monitoring the material distribution. I don't know how many times I've trained an inspector or coached up an inspector, and they said, hey, we did the calibration and everything was good, and then we went out at night and it looked all streaky. What am I doing wrong? It's like, well, once you do the calibration, that's kind of step one. Then you got to do this control strip and make sure everything is uniform. It doesn't happen by chance. You really have to have a lot of intent and attention to detail to get it right and to get it uniform.
Yeah, once it's done, it's a little late, and it's hard to go back over those markings and correct them. It's not impossible at all, but it stinks to have to go back out there and do it. So definitely monitoring it, like you're saying, while you're doing it is super important, and making sure you're doing it right. I think, Mike, you guys have in your symposium, you actually go over how to basically calibrate the bead drop and so forth. Is that correct?
Yeah, our Airfield Marking Symposium, which is essentially a public training on best practices of airfield markings. One of the things we do, we teach you the calibration process in class, and then we go out on the airfield and demonstrate that so you can see. And it's a pretty simple science. This is not rocket science, but there is a science to it, and it's fairly simple, fairly straightforward process. But somebody has to be doing it to make sure, again, attention to detail. Somebody has to be doing that not only for contractors, but in-house crews as well.
Great. All right, very good. All right, now let's move on to the methods of correction. So typically you're going to have one of two problems. Either you're going to have, because that's what's in the specs, right? You're either going to have a deviation of retroreflectivity that falls, that goes above that 30%, or you're going to have a retroreflectivity problem, which is going to cause that marking to, that's when that marking is below the minimum retroreflectivity. So there are basically a few methods in which we can correct that. And I'll let you start us out there, Mike.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, so really, when we're doing assessments, our goal for an airport is to tell you what you don't have to paint. We don't have any ties to any contracting side or business, so we get to be independent and unbiased, and we come in and we're really trying to reduce the amount of markings you have to paint. We want to see airports cleaning rather than repainting, and definitely rather than removing and repainting. That's where the cost gets exponentially higher, as you can see from this graph. I will say that it comes with the cleaning comes with a big caveat that it has to be installed well initially in order to even have a chance to clean it. If it's not installed well, let's say you have non-uniform markings or poor embedment, those beads are sitting high in the paint. Cleaning with maybe a pressure washer, but if you have, let's say, an ultra high pressure water blaster or a high pressure water blaster, something like that can actually take those beads completely out of the paint, and now you are into repainting, which is not what we're looking for. So I just wanted to quick digress. One of the things that we didn't mention with the new standard for minimum levels of reflectivity was a footnote that is in that, essentially FAA's standard for remarking when you're less than 100 millicandelas on white, 75 on yellow, 10 on red. They have a little footnote that says, prior to remarking, determine if removal of contaminants on the markings will restore retroreflectance. And that is a really good idea. That's very smart that the FAA included that. The idea is they're saying, hey, before you just go paint on top of whatever's out there, see if you can clean it first. Just like that airport in Kentucky I mentioned a couple of days ago, they found out that there's markings, there's actual paint under all of this algae. We just had to clean it and we're good to go.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's something that we should learn in the roadway industry as well. A lot of times you can go out there and clean the lines or clean the signs, and you'll find that that you can beef that or push that retroreflectivity back up just by, remember, it's light hitting glass and reflecting back. If there's something interfering with that, whether it be algae or anything else, and that light can't get through the glass to begin with, and then come back through the glass, it's going to dramatically decrease the retroreflectivity. I can't really add much more to this. It's just basically, the more you have to do, the more it's going to cost. Catching the problem early is important. And to understand, kind of as Mike said, many times I've seen this knee-jerk reaction is, let's just paint over the top the defect. And that rarely ends well, especially if you have a peeling problem, or if you have, for instance, mold, mildew, that kind of thing, because a lot of times that paint will stick to the mold and the mildew. As I said earlier, it'll stick to whatever it's sticking to. But if that's not sticking to what's under it, you're going to have problems, and you're going to have some peeling and so forth as well. I definitely would agree. Start with the idea of cleaning. I sell paint. And love to sell more paint, but in the end, it's about keeping that airport safe and doing it in an economic way or economical way. And definitely, if you can clean first, repaint. But then, of course, if you repaint, eventually you'll get to the point where you're going to have to remove and repaint. All right, fantastic. Now we'll check for any questions that we have out there for the evaluation basics, and I have a few here. So let's get started with Charles. Charles says, for wider paint markings, is there a way to reduce the stripe look? Well, I think he was writing this as we were talking. We kind of went over that. Mike, you want to address that real quick?
Yeah, there is a way to do it. A lot of people ask me, what should I be shooting for as far as the width of an overlap between paint guns or bead guns, and I think I know you can get it within about a 1/4 inch, but you really don't want to get much smaller than that. Usually, if I'm doing calibration for a contractor, for example, on a new construction project, I'm looking for about a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch overlap, and I'm trying to mitigate that as much as possible, just because of the aesthetic. A really heavy overlap obviously can look different than the rest of the marking that is not overlapping, or the rest of the material that's not overlapping. Um, and Greg, you mentioned that the architectural tips. I have seen that done with some success, but I mean I've seen it once. So that again, it's no matter what you're using, it's going to take a lot of attention to detail, quality control program from your contractor. Somebody's got to be watching that.
Okay, agreed completely. And then we go into what type of tips do you recommend? I'll kick that one off. So there's really three things when you're talking about tip types. We're going to use the airless because that's the most common machine used in the airfield environment and really in the roadway environment now. So you have the of course you have the brand, and of course the brand needs of course match the machine or at least the tip guard of what you have on the end of your gun. So the brand is really predicated by the brand of either tip guard or machine you have. Then you have the type of, is it a striping tip or is it an architectural tip? And we talked a lot about that. By far, striping tip is what you need to be using the majority of the time. And then you have the sizes, and the sizes are actually usually, and it depends on if you're using a Graco tip or a Titan tip, how that's actually written and what those numbers mean. But you have like a 417, a 419, 421, a 4 in some cases. A 4 means that it's for a 4-inch line. In some cases, that means it's made for an 8-inch line. So you have to just make sure you find out what that manufacturer's, what that 4 means. The 17 or the 2 digits behind it is how big that orifice is. If you're in a walk-behind machine, you're going to be pushing, in a Waterborne, you're going to need about a 17 or maybe even a 19. Oil-bornes, you're going to be at a 15, somewhere around there. And that's all walk behinds. If you have like what we see a lot of the push machines, like the Graco line driver or the lazy liner or some other device that's actually pushing the machine that you sit on, those move much faster. So now you're talking about you're going to need to jump that tip up. Instead of a 17, you're going to starve that line if you're riding behind it. So you're going to have to jump that up into the 20s and maybe even as much as a 26 if you're blowing and going. And then, of course, if you're in a truck, if you're running a truck, then you probably already know the answer to it. But those are usually 26 plus. So that's what you'll find a lot of times. That's the tip variances. Mike, what's your thoughts on that?
I think you did a really nice job kind of covering that, and really, I think the only other thing that I would mention is that typically regardless of what manufacturer it is, typically the salesman will tell you that you can go faster than what you'll need to go. I very often will see contractors and in-house crews trying to drive 5 miles an hour, upwards of 10 miles an hour. That's just not going to work. Or ride on that line laser and do 2 or 3 miles an hour. That typically doesn't work. The thing that I'd say, I'll summarize it this way. As far as the tip's concerned, for a 6-inch line, I'm typically looking for a 419, as Greg mentioned, maybe a 421. It definitely depends on a lot of different things: the viscosity of the material, how warm it is outside, and that changes during the day. So you might be starting off with a relatively you might start off at 6-inch at 10 a.m. and by 2 p.m. now you're spraying 7-inch. So you just have to pay attention to those things, and you might have to change a tip once in a while. For a 12-inch line, I typically, again, depending on all those variables, I try to start right around a 631, 633. Very often I'm going maybe a mile an hour to get enough paint down. And I know that makes an airless line a little ragged on the edges, but I actually like that. I'm looking for, kind of I'm looking for some texture in the paint film. So I want to see almost like a fruit peel look, like an orange or a grapefruit, something like that. It should ripple a little bit.
I like that. I like that description. I'm the same. I like to see that. The next question is, by the way, one of the best things to have out there in the field is a little wet mill gauge. You're going to want your type 1, type 2 paint to be around 13 to 15 mils thickness, and then type 3 you can go up to 20, 25 mils. But a little wet mill gauge thickness you can get it pretty much at any paint store, and you just put it in there. Now be careful, because if your pavement is, you want to run over something flat, so put a panel down or something and run over it at the same speed. It's funny how people tend to change their speed when they go over a test panel, but that's a great way to test it. The next question is, how long does thermoplastic usually last? I'll kick that one off too. In the roadway industry, thermoplastic, because it's so thick, it's usually 90 mils plus, so 90 to 125 mils. And so it's so thick compared to, remember what I was just saying, 15 wet mils, which dries down to about 10 dry mils or so. So you got 10 mils of paint in comparison to 90 mils of thermoplastic. So it will last nearly that times longer. So it's something that we use on the roadways because it lasts so long, and also because it has its retroreflectivity rejuvenates because it's got intermixed beads instead of just beads on top like paint does. So you'll get longer retroreflectivity, you'll get longer wear as well. But again, there are limitations as to where you can use this on the airfield. But in the roadway industry, I've seen thermoplastic last. Well, I've seen 10-year-old thermoplastic and it did okay, but realistically, 3 to 5 years, you could, on the interstate, you might be more, we've seen interstate 3 to 5 years as well, but definitely, about 3-year mark probably on the interstate. But in a runway environment, I'll leave that up to Mike. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, good information, Greg. Just to clarify, the type of thermoplastic that Greg was just referring to, that's 90 mils, 120 mils very often on the roadways, is a dye-extruded product. That is not approved for use on airfields. When we talk about thermoplastic, we're talking about the preformed thermoplastic variety. Essentially, it is I think it's great for markings that are very detailed, multicolored, stencils required. That's a great place to use a product like Airmark, for example. It's a very good product. I've seen it. The question is, how long does it last? There's so many variables. Obviously, traffic, the type of airport. I mean, are we talking about Columbus, Georgia, or Atlanta, Georgia? I think it really does depend. But what I've seen in the past is that I've seen markings that have lasted 10 years. I know the original test for preformed thermoplastic up at Newark was 10 years old. I think it was installed, and I'm going to get this wrong. I think it was installed in August of 2006, and I saw pictures of it in 2016. It was definitely beaten up on Taxiway November at EWR, but it was still performing. So I know it can last that long. How long does it usually last? That's longer than paint, but then that also, as far as paint's concerned, that also goes back to how well was the paint applied. And the preformed thermoplastic it's not foolproof. You still have an application element to it. So understand that a lot of it does come down to application as well.
All right, great. We're going to take one more question. By the way, that was from Jeremy. This one is from Tucker, and Tucker asked, let's see, with an airport that does a significant amount of snow removal each winter, are there any tips that come to mind to increase the longevity or again, does it go back to initial application? And I'm going to assume here that this is not the same tips that we've been talking about, but actual concepts or ideas that come to mind to increase their durability. I will say on our side, when we get into the northern regions and roadways, we start doing a lot of different things. We'll go to a flatter material. Like I said before, we're using thermoplastic usually below the sun belt, below the snow belt, they call it, or the snow plow belt. And so we will use a thicker material such as thermoplastic. And then once we get up again above that snow line, we'll start using a thinner material, which could be waterborne paints. It could be multi-component materials such as epoxy or MMA or polyurea, that type of thing. Those type of materials that are flatter to the ground so that the plow doesn't tend to chip them up. And then if we do decide to go with a more durable material like a thermoplastic or a tape, now I don't know. I'm really curious, Mike, you can answer this question, I'm sure, is what we do is we inlay that material. So they'll actually ground in, for instance, if it's a 100 mil product, they'll ground about a 125, 150 mil groove in the road, and then they'll inset that material, which provides an incredibly long and wearable material that's not affected by snowplows. Mike, what do we see in the airfield?
Well, as far as the inlaying, we just as a general practice, we do not do that. One of the reasons I think is that roads get overlaid a lot more often than airports do. So if anything changes, and now you have this this inlaid marking that has to move, that represents a much larger fix. With respect to the question itself, with an airport that does a lot of snow removal, how can you increase longevity? I will say, and I'll reference something we said earlier about cleaning versus repainting. One of the rebuttals, the number one rebuttal that I get from airports in the snow belt, are basically the rebuttal is, we have to repaint every year because our snow plows and our brooms remove all the markings. They chip it up and we have to repaint. Yes, you have to repaint year after year because the paint has built up so thick over time, and probably the last 10 or 20 years of remarking every single year, that your markings, all of your markings out there now have a profile, like 100 mil or 200 mil profile. So those snow plows have like a target to hit when you're scraping the pavement or brooming. The best chance, and we have a little bit of data on this that's coming in over the last few years, the best way to combat that and to make your markings last longer in those regions is to get back down, or essentially remove your markings back down at the pavement and put a very good application initially on the surface, uniformity, embedment, all those things. Then you have a much better job at surviving snowplows. We've got some data from Presque Isle, Maine, which is way up there in Maine. And they were able to apply, I believe they used a Waterborne type 3 paint with type 3 glass. They were able to survive an entire winter and not have to paint the following year, which saved, I think it saved taxpayer money. It was like $250,000 to paint that. And I might be wrong there, but so don't quote me. But it was a significant savings just for 1 year, not having to repaint the entire airfield. So it can be done, but very often airports can't just change one aspect. They've got to change the culture before they can start enjoying multiple years out of their markings in the snowbelt region.
Oh, that's great. And that's great to see. It really goes to show the right materials, the right application. It's got that upfront cost to it to get that quality, but man, it pays off down the road. That's for sure. All right, let's move on to our last segment, and we'll try to buzz through this for the sake of time. We're in our window of time. So this is management basics. We've talked about the specifications. We've talked about the inspection, the evaluation. Now we're going to just we're going to kind of talk about what are the basics of of managing the pavement markings. So, Mike, I'll let you kind of go through these and get started, and then we'll come back and go to them individually.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, so materials, we're talking about paint and glass. Traditionally, that's what we're using. We're usually using water-based paint, glass beads. With respect to the airfield environment, it is very important, and I think this is more for paint than it is for glass. If you are in an environment that has rust contamination, or you have an asphalt that has some rusty spots, or you see your existing markings are kind of rusty colored, or maybe you have algae or something growing, mold, something growing on top of your markings that's obscuring it. There's certain things that you can do to your paints. Very often you can talk to the manufacturer and have them add a biocide, for example, or add a stain resistant formulation to it to reduce that staining or growth of organisms on top. I will say that the number of quality manufacturers, and specifically paint manufacturers, I can count on one hand that I would use if it were my airport. So understand that they're not all created equal. Be very choosy, and do some homework, do some research about who the best manufacturers are out there. Greg.
Great, I would agree. We're actually let me advance that slide. So yeah, we're right now we're talking about the materials section, and I would agree completely on both of those. Is that you really need to do your homework, make sure you're selecting the right materials, because having the right materials is the basis of creating a good, safe, long-lasting, and really ultimately economical line. Each airfield has its unique needs and an environment around it, so you have to take that into consideration. And again, kind of following up on what Mike said, there are only a few type choices, type 1, type 2, type 3 bead, or type paint, or type 1, type 3 beads, but there's a lot of brand choices. So oftentimes type choices are far more easy than brand choices. So be sure to look for that, get references, that type of thing as well. So then let's go ahead and move to the next management aspect, which is the equipment. So basically, on equipment, you either rent or buy quality handheld retroreflectometers for routine inspections. This is something that's available to you. Again, we talked about the three methods of inspection, and one visual, one handheld, and one mobile. Yes, I'm a bit biased here, but if you don't use a retroreflectometer, then you have to deal with you or your inspector's opinions, and those will be biased. So that's why having the equipment, or obtaining the equipment, or we'll talk about in a moment, hiring someone with that equipment, how important that is. Routine inspections are super important. We have to remember that although you may be inspected only once a year, your customers are looking at and depending on these markings every single day. So, Mike, what do you have to say on that?
Yeah, I think the Stripe Master 2Touch is a really good unit. It's very reliable. One thing that we haven't really mentioned is that what I like to do with this for my clients when I'm doing quality assurance is to measure all of the markings per the ASTM and per the FAA spec. But then because it's GPS enabled, I like to upload them to like on a CAMZ file for a Google Earth, and I plot it on their airfield, and they think that's so cool. And I can show them where it passes the FAA criteria, where it fails. But I think that's what I think operations, maintenance groups at airports they really find this tool to be valuable for daily inspections. Again, we kind of touched on it. For periodic, you want more of a comprehensive airfield wide inspection. And I'll touch on one more thing that Greg said about the FAA. I think that having that comprehensive look at your, basically by an independent party, is a really good idea. I have already heard from, I'm not going to say where, I've already heard from some airports where the FAA inspector comes in and they will not be toting around reflectometers. That's not what the FAA wants to do. That said, an FAA inspector has already come in and said, "Hey, your markings look non-uniform. I don't think that they're bright enough." Or and then the airport had a reflectometer in. It was not me, so but they had a reflectometer come in, measure the markings, and they were performing well enough from a reflectivity standpoint, but not from a uniformity standpoint. And it became kind of messy. So I guess what I'm saying is, the subjective versus the objective, it gets a little messy. If you could have a report for your inspector to take a look at versus them go out on kind of a limb and do the old eye test, that would be a lot better, I think, for the industry. And it's all about safety. It's all about standardization. Let's make sure that the markings are looking the way they're supposed to look.
Yeah, that's great advice out there for dealing with those situations. And yeah, I'm familiar with that particular situation. And you're right. It was a situation where, in this case, I think it had to do with the deviation. And yeah, well, you put a retroreflectometer on it and it passed, but then it still didn't look right. And that's where we talk a lot about this inspection needing to make sure that you incorporate the three methods. Incorporate the visual with all of these. Incorporate the handheld with the visual and with the mobile, because a mobile device is really designed for what we call network-wide assessment. So it's really there to, even though it provides a tremendous amount of detail, but it's also to identify hotspots. And in both, as you mentioned, the mobile and the handheld does a real good job at laying this out on a map. You can actually see. You zoom in and you can see the runway, you can see the taxiways, and you can see that little yellow line turn red or green, yellow line turn green, whatever it is. Those are great tools to use, especially when you're sitting in front of your inspector, which really took us into a good segue into schedule routine and different types of inspections. And you touched on this, Mike. Talk a little bit about what you recommend on inspections. Oh, we've got we must have not unmuted. You want to try it again?
Yeah, I think it's a really good idea for daily inspections. I can see, operations agents, operations managers out there on the airfield, they're ultimately responsible for knowing and hopefully knowing objectively whether their markings are performing the way they're supposed to be. So periodic inspections are really fantastic. You got to do that as part of your almost your daily activity. Excuse me, your daily inspections you've got to do on a daily basis, and your periodic inspections. I think for most airports, and I'm talking about maybe the top 200, as far as size is concerned. Annual is probably a good idea. Really, the busier you get, if you want to see trend analysis, maybe increase that to biannual assessments, airfield-wide assessments. And the smaller you get, probably the more you can get out to two, and these instead of annual assessments, doing them biannually every 2 years. I think it's a pretty good schedule.
Yeah, so you would do basically your visual inspection pretty much every time you're out on the airfield, but weekly, kind of just we'll talk about that in a moment, actually, a little bit more. And then you get into your periodic, which could be every quarter, that type of thing. Handheld, I can see that. Just kind of a rotation thing might be part of your visual checks when you're out there identifying things that, hey, maybe we need to take a look at that. But definitely, I agree with for full assessment, full airfield assessment. If you're going to use a mobile device, definitely, once a year on those larger airports for sure. Um, and then maybe more often again, like you said, I agree completely with if you're trying to create some type of maintenance schedule, especially the first few, you might have more frequently so that you can see what's happening. Also, by doing that, it's not only predictive maintenance, but it's also and predictive budget requirements, which is always important, but also it gives you a chance to analyze materials used or the application process that's being used. Um, I wrote here as a note that not only are airfield-wide inspections important for safety and compliance, they're also very useful in this predictive maintenance scheduling that we talked about, and it really does make your team more efficient and what they do more effective. We do understand that a lot of you guys are out there and you maintain your own markings, and that's really cool. But the guy that maintains your markings is probably the guy that also fixes your lights or fixes your signs or does sweeping. I mean, there's no telling what else he does. So we
Mows the
have to
grass.
remember. Yeah, mows the grass, So this guy is a multifunctional guy, and so he's not really potentially likely not an expert at pavement markings. So of course that's going to get us to um, really into the next one, which is training. So this is train all airfield personnel on basic inspection techniques to identify potential marking issues in the normal course of duty. This is what we were talking about a moment ago. This is certainly Mike's area of expertise in the airfield. Applying and managing pavement markings is oftentimes, as I said earlier, an added duty for these maintenance guys. And so they lack this specific training. And really, honestly, their markings oftentimes tells the story. And you can overlook the importance of a well-trained striper and for either the roadway or the runway. So that's a very important aspect is to make sure that your people are trained. I'll pass that back over to Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. This is something that the FAA focused on in the latest revision to the 150 5340-1M, M for Mike. In that AC, which was published or revised and published on May 10th of 2019, so just a few months ago, they added some language that says, and this is paragraph 1.3.8 for anyone that wants to find it. They say personnel involved in the application of airfield surface marking should complete training, which includes surface preparation, removal, and application of surface markings and maintenance standards, period. That is brand new, but they're basically saying, hey, anybody that's doing this marking out there should be trained. And that's a no-brainer, but it's taken us, 10 years to get that really in the circular. I think that it's so important for any aspect of work on an airfield or really any industry. Training is so key, and it's not just for the guys that do the application. It's not just for the guys that do the painting. This is really for operations people too. So, when you see on this slide, it says, train all airfield personnel on basic inspection techniques to identify those potential marking issues, perhaps risks. We're talking about operations people there. We're talking about our folks that are monitoring the airfields 24/7. So they need to know what to look for too. They need to be able to communicate perhaps with their in-house crew, for example, their maintenance department, exactly what's going on. Maybe they're writing a work order. They can be a little more specific on the issue if they've had training.
Yeah, I think it's so important that again, kind of going back to what we both said, is just that everybody knows what to look for, and I think it makes the system much better all the way around. So next we're going to education. And so remember we had training and then we have education, and properly educate marketing personnel on specifications, materials, application, and equipment operation. So the training, let's not mix up training and education, because you can be well educated on something but not know how to properly implement that knowledge, and or vice versa. You can know how to install a marking, but you also need to know the what, the why, the where, and the how, and the when, behind the marking. So the education piece is more kind of an in-depth understanding of those things: what, why, when, where, and how. So it's very important to go beyond just, okay, this is how you operate the machine and put a line down, but you need to go deeper. And I think that's where I believe, the symposiums and those type of trainings go a little deeper and say, okay, well, this is why you have to do this, or this is what you're trying to achieve. What is our goal here? Our goal is not to get paint on the pavement. Our goal is to have a visible line that meets these requirements. Mike?
Yeah, it's a really nice distinction between training and education. Uh, Greg, you sit with me on an oversight committee for the creation of an airfield marking certificate program, the creation of that curriculum. And I think I see the little graduate cap there, and it made me kind of think about the certificate training that we've developed, and it's something that I think that will really help to qualify those that stripe our airfields, whether it be contractors, whether it be in-house crews, really whether it be people that inspect or design these airfield marking projects. And I think it's so important for people not only to have uh, kind of similar knowledge, at least the minimum knowledge areas that we've helped to expand on in that curriculum, the certificate training, but it really will help raise the bar on what the expectation is and what the expectation is for education and also for training.
Great. Okay, now we are at right at the end of our presentation, but we've got a few questions here and a couple comments, and I'll go over those real quick. We've got Rhonda says, well, where can you rent a retroreflectometer? We'll actually cover that in the next slide. The next one is from Jim. Jim says, just a comment. Remember that the contractor is not always right, either with accuracy or proper application. Trust but verify. Great suggestion. Thank you, Jim, for that comment. Jared, he says, do you have any recommended project bid language for airports to use to filter out low bid contractors that might fluff their qualifications? What about descriptions for premium materials and equipment? What's your thought on that, Mike?
Really good question from Jared. That is, yeah, that's tough. So many times low bidder gets the job, and when you're dealing with new construction, very often it's your consultant engineer that is selecting a prime, and then that prime goes out and finds the same company that they always use as a subcontractor for marking. So it's very difficult to have kind of control over who you get in there to paint your markings. It can get again, it can get a little messy. So one of the things that is a really good idea is to start inputting language and really having your in the design stage of that project, or before a solicitation goes out, a bid goes out and hits the street for bid, put some language in your specification that helps to perhaps, I don't want to use the word steer. We're not trying to steer contracts, but we want to qualify contracts. So maybe you say, one of my favorite things to put in there is the marking equipment, especially if it's a runway project or if there's wider markings involved, the marking equipment must be able to apply a 6-inch to a 36-inch line in a single pass. That essentially is specifying truck mounted equipment. It's really important. You do not want to see a small machine painting a 30-foot wide by 150-foot long aiming point marking on the airfield. They'll be there 2 weeks from now. So, that's one thing that you can do. There's a lot of good information as far as how to enhance your specifications in, I believe it's Appendix A in the back of the Airfield Marking Handbook, and that is available for download. You can download it for free on my website, sightline.us. There's a bunch of good information. I'm just going to say one more thing about that. He asked something about descriptions of equipment. You can ask for equipment submittals. You can say, hey, show me and describe what equipment what you intend to use on my project. I want to vet that equipment. And if it's if it's a small machine for a runway, that ain't the contractor you want. So that's just another way, but there are several different ways you can do it.
And I would tack onto that to ask the same questions on the materials, because if they're bidding this, obviously they're going to, it's unfortunate, but it's just the way it is that if the FAA requires, let's say you're requiring a Type 2 waterborne paint, it's oftentimes that contractor is going to go out and find the lowest bid Type 2 paint. And as long as it looks good when they leave, they're going to be content. Unfortunately, you may not be so 6 months later. So be sure to, that might be some consideration as well, as ask for submittals of what paint they're going to use. I think that's critical. And then do your homework on that paint. So yeah, that'd be my advice on that. I got, let's see, another question or a comment. Rodney says, we use 627 tips in Louisiana. So that was back on our talking about our tip thing. And the next one is the last one I've got is from Stacy, and she says, "Can we get a copy of this webinar?" So let's kind of go over. We'll close up here with this. This brings us to the end of our presentation on what we call the quick guide to airfield marking assessment. So you certainly you'll be able to get a copy of this presentation, a recording of it, and you'll also be able to get a copy of the airfield, the quick guide to airfield marking assessment, which is the document that this was all based on. And you can get those from our website at pppcatalog.com/AFM for airfield markings. And a little story or a little bit about us as a transportation safety innovation company. We provide mobile retroreflectometers to purchase. We also provide handheld retroreflectometers for purchase and rent. And something not on here, we do provide a high performance waterborne Type 2, but yet high build. There's a requirement on Type 3s that sometimes let's just say it's a restriction that we're not willing to abide by, because we feel that our paint is better than that. So we do not qualify for a Type 3, but we are a high build Type 2. So you can give me a call. We can talk about that over a cup of coffee. But anyhow, so we provide those materials, and of course, Mike, he'll tell you a little bit about what they do. And if this information is probably going to be available, at least some of it or all of it, on his own website. Mike, I think first of all, I want to just thank you for your participation in this. And I think us together with our two different backgrounds has been very helpful, hopefully for our audience. And definitely couldn't do this without you. You've been a really a great guide and even I would go as far as say a mentor in the airfield marking industry for us, to be able to take our experience and knowledge of the marking materials and marking methods and so forth, and to be able to convert that and use that knowledge properly in the airfield. You've been a very important part of getting us to where we are today. So thank you. And I'll leave it for Mike to tell a little bit about his what he offers and to close us out.
Well, many thanks, Greg. Yeah, I think think that our collaboration has been really good over the past couple of years. You guys are responsible in large part for showing us the way out of the analog, you know, out of the analog and into the digital world. Really, I mean, with the adoption of the mobile unit that we use, the handheld that we use from PPP, really just pairs so nicely with our visual inspection that we've been doing for years and years and years. You know, with those assessment services, certainly they're available on our website, sightline.us. US like United States. We also talked a little bit about certificate training. The Airfield Marking Symposium is a public training. It's not currently a certificate training, but it's a great opportunity to get not only some hands-on experience, but also hear about the latest and greatest in policies, standards, and technology. We just finished our Tampa Symposium, and it was we had record attendance. We had 70 attendees there. It was pretty awesome. The 2020 or 2020 schedule will be out soon, so keep an eye out for that. You can register, or you can take a look online, or just subscribe to our newsletter, and you'll get updates on that. But just want to say, thanks very much, Greg, for inviting me back, and hopefully our attendees really got a lot of value out of this.
Okay, thank you very much, and I appreciate it. And thanks for everybody listening in. And again, if you would like to contact either of us, you see here our contact information. And God bless, and have a great day.